Holy City Center Radio is episode 291, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Monday, September 2nd, 2024. Hey all, it's Labor Day, and I hope you are not laboring at all. I hope you are enjoying a day off, maybe part of a 3-day weekend, or maybe you had to work the weekend but are off today. Regardless, I hope you have an amazing day, and thank you so much for spending part of it here with me with Holy City Center Radio. Can't believe it's September already. Wow, time is flying by. But you're not here to listen to me talk about the passage of time, which I tend to do every single month. Every time there's a new month, I'm like, can't believe it's a new month already. And I know I can't help myself. But it is genuinely like, man. In any event, we've got some news to get you caught up on. Some of these stories I couldn't get to in Friday's episode. It was just too jam-packed. So without any further delay, let's get into it. Well, South Carolina is primed to get back to executing those on death row. We've talked about this a lot over the past year or so. And although it doesn't appear that they will be stopped at this point, although there are some folks out there, certain groups that are still trying to find ways to maybe sue to stop executions. But it seems like things are ready to be picked up. But there are still some topics of discussion that are being debated. This one is about the amount of time between sending inmates to the death chamber. So the South Carolina Supreme Court won't allow another execution in this state until it determines what the minimum amount of time between sending inmates to death should be. So although the state has the green light to continue executions and they have one set for September 20th, the Supreme Court here in the state has decided until we determine what the minimum amount of time is before we carry out the next execution, we're going to put things on hold. So we'll see what ends up happening. So here's what's going on. So as I mentioned, the first execution in the state is set for September 20th. It is still on the schedule. It's going to be the first execution in the Palmetto State in over 13 years. And this is after we've talked about it before. First, they couldn't execute inmates because they were unable to secure drugs for lethal injection. And in the state constitution, an inmate had to choose between either lethal injection or the electric chair. And because one option was removed and they weren't able to choose, the state couldn't carry out any executions. Then they ended up bringing back the firing squad. That got challenged. And so you can revisit all that if you like. So there are 3 methods of execution. Inmates still have to choose one of those 3. And now that lethal injection drugs were able to get procured by the state again, they have those 3 options, and everything is back on, course the way that some in the state want it to be. And that execution that's going to happen on the 20th is for Freddie Eugene Owens, if you want to look into that case. So although they set Owens' execution date last Friday, well, actually 2 Fridays ago now, the court also agreed to take up a request from 4 other death row inmates who are out of appeals to require the state to wait at least 3 months between executions. In its response, state prosecutors suggested setting the minimum time frame at no longer than 4 weeks between executions. So you have 4 inmates on death row saying, you got to wait at least 3 months. Whereas the state is saying, no, the minimum amount of time shouldn't be any longer than 4 weeks. So currently, the Supreme Court can set executions as close together as a week apart. That accelerated schedule would rush lawyers who are trying to represent multiple inmates on death row, or at least that's what a lawyer for the inmates wrote in court papers. So basically saying, like, that's not enough time to make sure that we are properly working on behalf of our clients, looking into appeals, seeing if the governor might halt an execution for whatever reason, and so on and so forth. So they're looking for more time. On the other side of things, the attorneys argued that prison staff who have to take extensive steps to prepare to put an inmate to death, this could end up leading to things like a botched execution. So I'm not sure why taking more time and being meticulous with planning and all that would lead to botched executions, but that's what they're arguing. An interesting question. I hadn't really thought about this. What are the requirements behind the scenes as far as, can they just, if people are on death row and if it just lines up appropriately a day or two apart, can they just go forward with it? What are the reasons not to? So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how long after that first execution, assuming nothing happens that we have not foreseen and that somehow gets delayed or stopped. It'd be interesting to see how long executions after that are halted, and what the arguments will continue to be for both sides of this. And I'll be sure to keep you up to date. But for those of us that were kind of like, I'm not so keen on the state killing people, I'm not so sure about this death penalty thing. This isn't the news of, hey, look, they're halting him completely, it's been ruled unconstitutional or anything like that. It's but it is an interesting story that I don't think a lot of us saw coming, and I'll be sure to keep you up to date. Getting back down to the city level, the city of Charleston recently released what they're calling the water plan. I'd mentioned that there was going to be a public meeting about it, and now you can actually see the plan online. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, but if you really want to dig into the details, visit the link in the show notes. That story will give you some details, but it also links to the city's website where you can actually see the plan itself. So, what is the water plan? As I mentioned previously, it's essentially something that the city hopes will steer this, Charleston through decades of sea level rise and a changing climate, and help the city come out, without any extensive damage, any big issues, and just basically learn to live with rising sea levels and what we can do, to prevent things like damage, injuries to people, especially when there's storms that come through, and things like that. So they've presented it, and it's now up to city leaders to actually implement its recommendations. And of course, the city's residents will also have a say. Whether it's if you want to reach out to council members, the mayor, you want to attend city council meetings to give your opinion and things like that, you certainly can. So the water plan is also what the city calls a roadmap for dozens of infrastructure projects. Those are ones that have already been approved and we know about, and any potential ones that could come up. And it's going to be, this plan is for, all over the city, and it's supposed to cover the coming decades to address flooding from things like storm surge, rising seas, groundwater, and rainfall. So the plan is taking a little bit of a different look than some former administrations, mayors in this town have done when it comes to rising tides and climate change and things. So instead of like breaking it down by neighborhood, which some other plans have done, or maybe breaking it down by city council district, this plan instead is looking at the 18 water basins that are carved out by Charleston's major rivers and creeks. So this is a little bit different way of looking at the water situation in Charleston versus previous attempts by the city. So that part's certainly interesting and something I want to look more into. I haven't really, it's also, when it comes to government plans, it can be a little heavy to look at and confusing, and it could take a while to get through. But as I mentioned, you can go look into it as much or as little as you want to via the link in the show notes. But just like a quick kind of look at how important this stuff is, even though we all have talked about climate change, we all have opinions on it and things. Regardless of all that, you can't deny that sea levels are rising, regardless of why you think that is, or if you think it's like a cyclical thing that's going to go away or whatever. Sea levels in Charleston specifically, we have some data that we can point to. Specifically, the sea levels in Charleston have risen by more than a foot in the past century. And the city is expected to see another foot plus of sea level rise by 2050. So not only is it rising, it seems to be rising a little bit quicker. And this is according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Now, in addition to the water rising for climate change, sea level rise, all that stuff, it's also, it's working hand in hand with the city, who has filled and destroyed some of the tidal wetlands and creeks, which of course worsens tidal flooding. You can look into the city's history and how a lot of stuff has just been built on wetlands and creeks and isn't exactly as stable as maybe we would hope it would be. Now, some specific numbers. Since tracking began in October of 1921, Charleston has experienced what they deemed 49 major tidal floods. So since 1921, there have been 49 major tidal floods. 35 of those 49 have occurred since January of 2015. That's the shocking part. So they've been keeping tabs on this since 1921. And there's been just shy of 50 major tidal flooding events, and 35 of them have occurred since January 2015. Uh, that's showing you that this problem is worsening. It's not getting better. And not only is it not getting better, like I said, it seems to be just getting exponentially worse. So those numbers are not meant to scare you in any major way, but just kind of point out that, hey, as a city, as a community, we have to look into these things, see what the city is proposing, and if you see something that you don't think makes sense, be sure to bring it up to leaders. Go to meetings, let them know what you believe. Maybe this plan is something that would be really beneficial, and it's a novel and interesting look at something that we haven't looked at in this way. Or maybe it seems like there's nothing they can do and none of this is going to help. So who knows? That you have to go and look and decide what you think. I'm certainly glad that the city's at least trying something new. And again, I haven't looked at it in any huge significant way where I have a really strong opinion, but I do appreciate that they're trying something. So again, visit the link in the show notes. You can go dive in as much as you want to some of the data and the plans, and see what you think as well. We have some potential drama that could end up being a legal issue in North Charleston. There is a steakhouse and lounge located on Dorchester Road. So it's in a shopping center on that road. Um, and there's some sort of tie to a city councilman. It's a little bit unclear of what exactly that city councilman's role is. Um, which is fine, in and of itself. This business has recently rebranded just over a year after opening, which again, on its own, not a big deal. But there's also, it does appear, according to reporting from the Post and Courier, that this restaurant has not paid hospitality taxes since it opened. And that's where the real potential issue comes in here. So there's that restaurant I'm referencing used to be called the Montague Room. It rebranded just over a year after opening and is now called El Patio Caribbean Restaurant and Lounge. And this is all according to a June 11th letter that was signed by the owner. And obviously you can go and see the physical change for yourself if you'd been there before and after. Now, that letter from the owner is significant because on June 11th, that was around the time that the State Law Enforcement Division, also known as SLED, had closed an investigation into an interaction that was involving North Charleston City Councilman Jerome Hayward and a North Charleston police officer. So that investigation had to do with an officer that was sent to address a noise complaint at the restaurant. And, and that's where things started to become a little murky with what exactly Hayward's role was or is with this restaurant. So in addition to the noise complaint and that there was some kind of investigation that involved Councilman Hayward, the Post and Courier, while they're looking into this, also found that the business had not paid local hospitality taxes since it opened. Records also show, according to the newspaper, that the Blue Note Bistro, which is a since shuttered restaurant with ties to another council member, also had not paid hospitality taxes for a year either, which prompted a city official to raise concerns over accountability. The Blue Note Bistro was co-owned by District 1 Councilman Mike Brown and his business partner Henry Smalls. This was previously reported by the Post and Courier. So now there's these two council members who have ties to restaurants that are apparently not paying their hospitality taxes. And obviously this raises all sorts of questions, but as a city official mentioned, where's the accountability here? If we can't get our council members to do what they're supposed to do, that who else is trying to get away with this stuff and is? And I should say, when I say things like getting away with, we don't know the details of why these taxes weren't paid, what may have happened, who's responsible and things. So we're just keep that in mind. I'm kind of just speaking broadly. Going back to Hayward, he had previously stated he was not the owner of the Montague Room, but there have been instances where he kind of presented himself as such. There's an old story from ABC News 4 that mentioned that he was the owner. And so what exactly his involvement is with that restaurant is pretty unclear at this point. And also, of course, the restaurant's rebrand happening around the same time that SLED had closed an investigation and into that restaurant, an incident that happened there. And when city officials became aware of unpaid hospitality taxes, also raises some questions like, was this already in the works? Why did they change the name? Is it completely unrelated? Was it some way to try to get around these taxes or draw attention away from, there's still some questions about why this rebrand happened. So Hayward was actually elected to council back in 2019. He was reelected last year for a second 4-year term. He's a former Charleston police officer, but unfortunately for him, this isn't the first time his name has been involved with something controversial. And again, we don't really know exactly what role he had with this restaurant. And regardless of what role he had, where his responsibility lies, if anywhere, with this whole hospitality tax business. But regardless, his name's being brought up in this. And it's not the first time. When he was a police officer, he was actually fired in 1992 for allegedly associating with a suspected drug dealer. This was reported on at the time by the Post and Courier as well. Hayward denied the accusation and continues to deny it. In addition to that, he's had some financial issues that date back decades. Again, this is according to Post and Courier's reporting. At the time, this is back from an article in 2021. At that time, he had filed 3 bankruptcies since 1997 and had not paid federal taxes for at least 4 years. And at that time, it said that he faced more than $1 million in debt. So all sorts of questions about finances from his past. And now, wait, he's involved with this restaurant that's not paying hospitality taxes? So there's that whole aspect of it. And then the realization that there was another restaurant that had ties to another council member, as I mentioned, that wasn't paying its hospitality taxes. So great job by the Post and Courier reporting on this. Visit the link in the show notes for more details, but a whole lot of questions that need to be answered and things that need to be figured out. And this should happen no matter what, but especially since it involves, sitting politicians on the city council. And our last story is something that actually occurred back in July and was a little fishy, a little concerning, and it's been brought back up by someone who's running for Dorchester County Sheriff. It's a candidate for that position. Had brought back up that we really haven't had any updates on this situation. And what that situation is back at the end of July, the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office announced that it was investigating an incident that happened with what they called an untimely death of one of their canines. So, canines, of course, a term that's used for dogs that are used in police service. What is this untimely death? Well, the dog, who was over 5 years old, so obviously not an old dog by any means, was found dead in his handler's vehicle. At that time, News 4 asked the spokesperson for the sheriff's office whether or not the AC was on in the vehicle at the time of the dog's death, and the spokesperson declined to comment. The spokesperson also said back at the end of July that no further statement would be released until the conclusion of an investigation and the review of the necropsy results, which, autopsy basically. So obviously at the time, it's like, wait a minute, a dog died in a police vehicle. His handler wasn't in the vehicle. How does that happen? And then a very straightforward question of, well, I mean, was the AC on? You're leaving a dog in a locked car in South Carolina in, the middle of summer, late July. Was it the AC on? And declined the comment. Now, that doesn't mean the AC wasn't on. It doesn't mean it was. It doesn't mean he's trying to hide anything, the spokesperson, that is. But, it could be one of those things like, hey, I know the answer, but because this is an ongoing investigation, I'm not going to say anything, because even if it was on, doesn't mean that there isn't some other fault of the handler, perhaps. And if it wasn't on, maybe there was no, even though that should be something that the handler should still be punished for, the dog could have died before, any kind of heat related issues could have come up. So it could be one of those things, but certainly doesn't look good that he wouldn't even answer that. And so, it was interesting that this happened. It's been almost a month now, and there's been no updates. So certainly something we want to keep an eye on, and absolutely, as always, I will let you know if there's any updates. But for those of you in Dorchester County, maybe something you want to ask about, or whether it's through email or talking to people who work on the county council or whatever city council you may be, whatever city you're in. Maybe something to ask and see if we can get some more answers here, because something bad happened to this dog. And if his handler is at fault, should be held accountable in some manner. And it's just odd that it's been essentially a full month and we haven't heard anything. But as I said, I will certainly keep you up to date. That'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Hope you have an amazing week ahead. Thank you so much for listening. If it's not too much trouble, if you haven't already, whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on, go ahead and like this podcast, subscribe, rate it, review it, whatever you can do. Maybe even just share it with someone you think will listen. Any of that stuff will help out to make sure that there's more of a chance that this will pop up in people's feeds or get recommended for folks who are looking for new podcasts. So I would greatly appreciate it. You can also take that separate step to help out by going to patreon.com/Holy City Center. There's some different support tiers that you can sign up for that help offset some of the costs with the podcast and the website. But if you can't or already have, that's okay. I appreciate your support and listening. That is more than enough, and I greatly appreciate it. And I also need to say thank you to Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Soundsystem for producing this and every episode of Holy City Center Radio, and also Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every show. I'll be back later this week. Can't wait to be back on the microphone. But until then, good night and good luck.